I think we'll get going. So just quickly before I start, I'm using two screens. So if it looks like I'm gazing into the distance, I'm trying to work with two screens. So just bear that in mind. I just want to thank people for joining. My name's Naveed, and my pronouns are he, him. If you'd like to put your pronouns in your Zoom name, then please do so. My other facilitators have done the same. This session will be a little bit different than advertised. We had planned for you to hear from speakers directly impacted by these issues. Unfortunately, we've not been able to do that, but it is a topic we want to explore further in LARAF, so we hope to be able to do this in the future. However, we also recognize that it's the case that a few Black trans people of color are having to continually take on the burden of educating others on their lived experience and how to show solidarity. So in that respect, we decided to move forward with the session and take on the challenge of self-education. And that will take the form of looking at the issues facing trans people of color and group work on how we can make spaces safe and show solidarity. And you will actually hear from trans and queer people of color through the form of video clips. The other thing to mention as well is that throughout this talk, I'll mention trans people, I'll mention non-binary people, I'll mention gender diverse people, I'll mention Black trans people, and I'll mention trans people of color. I completely accept that these aren't all homogenous communities. For the sake of this talk, I may interchange between the two, but it's just something to note. I'm going to be presenting the majority of this work, and I'm a queer Muslim person of color. However, I'm not Black and I'm not trans, so there'll be significant limitations on what I can speak to. If at any point, any trans person, gender diverse person, or non-binary person of color wants to contribute, wants to correct me, then the platform is yours. You just need to let me or one of the facilitators know in the chat. And in fact, can the other facilitators do a wave or something to let you know that they're there? So you can message them. If you don't want to speak up directly, then you can message me and I can raise your contribution anonymously at the appropriate time. The last thing to say is on how we, before we get going, is on how we engage with each other during the session. The normal rules of step forward, step back apply. So if you're somebody who contributes a lot, then maybe take a step back. And if you don't speak up a lot, then take a step forward, and others should allow you the space to do that. Additionally, this isn't going to be a space in which we will discuss the validity of trans or non-binary identities or any perceived conflicts with other human rights. If you're on that journey, then please message again one of us privately, and we'd be happy to share resources to help you move forward on that. There will be facilitated breakout rooms for discussion. There may be some opportunity for Q&A, but to be completely frank, I'm not going to be best placed to answer a lot of those questions. There may be people within the Zoom chat who can answer those questions, but we just want to be really careful to not claim expertise where we don't have it. And please kind of introduce yourselves in the chat as well if you wish to. So the first thing I'm going to do in terms of content is I want to show a couple of clips from Laverne Cox, who is a American Black trans woman, activist and actor, who's obviously in a much better position to speak on the intersection of racism, transphobia, misogyny and classism. The clip I'm about to show starts from about a minute in, where she'd already described an incidence of catcalling. So this is my first attempt at the technology. So let's see how this goes.
But this moment makes me think about the interesting intersections of identity and oppression that far too many trans women of color experience on a day-to-day basis, living our lives as ourselves. So let's break it down a little bit. So first of all, I was catcalled because I'm a woman. Now, some trans women I know find being catcalled an affirming thing. I've never felt that way. I've often felt unsafe when I've been catcalled. I felt like these men are trying to objectify me, to take ownership of my body in public space. And I often have felt unsafe in these moments, and I believe this is a misogynist moment. So we have this misogynist moment of me being catcalled, and then I am misgendered when they realize that I am trans. So we have this transphobic moment. Julia Serrano calls the intersection of transphobia and misogyny trans misogyny. So we have this trans misogynist moment, and then we have the racial component, the use of the N-word. We talk about the disproportionate discrimination that so many trans people face. Often we're talking about working class trans women of color. Often the unemployment rate in this country is twice the national average for trans people, but it's 4 times the national average for trans people of color. The homicide rate in the LGBTQ community is highest amongst trans women. In 2012, over 53% of the homicides were trans women, 73% were people of color. In the LGBTQ community, that is something as a queer community we should be aware of. And so the intersectional conversation becomes really important because then we say, well, why is it that it's Black trans women who are disproportionately affected by violence, right? So there's something about them being Black and maybe being in certain neighborhoods and these intersections of oppression. There's this wonderful organization in New Orleans. I was in New Orleans last week, and there's a group called Breakout. Breakout, you know, Breakout. And this is another sort of celebrity moment that recently happened. Gabrielle Sidibe was on the Arsenio Hall show, and she talked about being in New Orleans and witnessing. She used the T word that ends with a Y that a lot of our community finds objectionable. But I think the takeaway from the interview is that she talked about witnessing all of these trans women being arrested. She was like, what is going on with all these trans women being arrested? And she thought it was some trans on trans crime thing. But what Gabrielle Sidibe was really witnessing was the epidemic of trans women of color being profiled by the police in New Orleans.
Laverne in that clip mentioned a few statistics that I just want to reinforce. And before I do so, and I think this is always important to note when we're talking about the struggles of a discriminated community, is that the Black trans community is not solely defined by these statistics, just in the same way that any discriminated community isn't solely defined by its struggles. It's a rich, vibrant community, but obviously here we're talking about how we can show solidarity. And also the other thing to note as well is that almost all of the stats I've been able to compile are from the US context. And this is largely to do with my own position with regards to this. So I'm not an expert, but also it's an indictment on the way both official and unofficial statistics are collected in the UK, which are poor not only with regards to documenting experiences of trans people, but obviously it's even worse for trans people of color. So for example, when I was doing the research for this, I saw that the ONS had written in a response to a request for information that it is not possible to identify transgender victims in current homicide statistics, and the sex of a homicide victim is determined by the police force that records the crime. And just to then, talk about where unofficial statistics are collected, I also recall a couple of years ago, a list of female victims of partner violence was read out by a Labour MP, Jess Phillips, and they pointedly excluded trans women from those statistics. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that data. If there is anybody within the chat that can share information of where we can understand this issue more in the UK, then please do so for the benefit of us and everybody within the group. So coming onto the slide, and as we were talking about violence against trans women, I just want to draw attention to the image in the top left-hand corner, and that is Naomi Hershey, who was a Black trans woman and she was murdered a couple of years back. She was described by her friends as one of the most caring people they had ever met. But what was absolutely tragic in the reporting about her death was that she was frequently misgendered and frequently misnamed. And thinking about that context, again, whilst I was doing my research, I saw that a lot of trans people, when they report hate crimes to the police, again, they are misgendered, misnamed when they're reporting those crimes. And when you think about, as I'm sure a lot of you will have discovered or learnt about during the other sessions, when you think about a police force that is institutionally racist, it obviously means that trans people of color, Black trans people, are even less likely to report crimes against them. So not only do we have very little in terms of statistics in the UK, even as we go on that journey, it's likely to be underreported. If we move on to the text then, on the right side of the slide, and that speaks to information from the Human Rights Council, which, as I say, is based in the US. And they speak to the fact that 130 fatal acts of violence have occurred towards trans people since 2013. 80% of those victims were trans women of color. So, as we say, like, this is the majority of that 130, but something to bear in mind within that, and this speaks to what Laverne Cox was saying in her video, is that not only does that speak to the intersection of transphobia and racism, but also trans misogyny, and the fact that they were trans women who were victims. The image below as well speaks to some of those victims, the mural on the left, and those are images of Dominique Remy Falls, Nina Pop, and Tony McDade. In terms of that graphic then, and I found that a really useful way to try and understand the various kind of intersections that you see when speaking and thinking about this issue. I wasn't going to go through it in detail, but I think we probably do have enough time to just take a look at it. And it just, as I say, kind of speaks to the various components which combined together lead to a high risk of violence for trans people of color, in particular trans women of color. And that first bubble speaks to the dehumanization of trans people, the anti-trans stigma that we see, the hostile political climate. We're obviously seeing it here in the UK, even though this graphic is from the US. The lack of family acceptance, the cultural marginalization and invisibility. That can obviously then lead to the denial of opportunity, which is that second bubble, preventing full participation in society, setbacks in education, employment discrimination, barriers if immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And I think that's really important to focus on. There was reporting recently of the number of cases the Home Office rejects of asylum claims of people from the LGBT community, and it's incredibly high because the burden of proof to prove that you've been discriminated against for being LGBTQ is so high within our immigration system that most of those claims are rejected. Then obviously you have the exclusion from health and social care services, unequal policing and criminal justice system. Laverne there mentioned how trans people of color were being profiled by the police during a protest, and barriers to legal identification. And obviously we've had the campaign for the GRA here, and unfortunately a lot of lukewarm support from the Labour Party, particularly obviously under this new leadership. And all of this can either lead to or be exacerbated by increased risk factors. So intimate partner violence and sexual assault, engagement in survival sex work, poverty and homelessness, physical and mental health disparities. And then obviously that blue streak across the entire thing speaks to the fact that all of these issues are exacerbated by racism, sexism. I don't need to obviously go into the inequalities in healthcare, etc., if you're a person of color, etc. So obviously all of that combined together leads to the high risk of violence. The next slide I'm going to speak to is from the US National LGBTQ Task Force, who did a study quite specifically on this issue of experiences of Black trans people, which revealed some genuinely shocking statistics. And this is just a few of the, I was going to say highlights, but I guess lowlights. And as I said earlier, we'll share the slides and we'll share the reports and resources that went along with them. I'm saying that without having discussed this with other facilitators, but I'm going to take that as that being possible. So looking at some of these statistics, what they found during the report, got a thumbs up there from Sam, so that's great. So looking at some of these statistics, which were discovered during the report, they found that Black transgender people had an unemployment rate of 26%, which was twice that of transgender people generally, and 4 times the national rate within the US. 41% of Black respondents said they had experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, which is more than 5 times the national rate. Black transgender people lived in extreme poverty at twice the rate of transgender people generally, and 4 times the general Black population, and 8 times the national rate. 20% of Black transgender people were living with HIV, compared to 2% for transgender people generally, or Black people more generally, so 2% for both those communities. Half of Black respondents to this survey who attended school where they were expressing a transgender identity or a gender non-conformity reported facing harassment, and nearly half of Black respondents reported having attempted suicide. Yeah, there's not really an awful lot I can kind of add to that. Those statistics do speak for themselves. There was, some positive information in there, and I want to kind of use that as a segue to the next kind of section of this discussion or this presentation. The report did also show that many Black transgender people who were out to their families reported that their families were just as strong as before they came out. And Black respondents reported this experience at a higher rate than the overall sample of transgender respondents. And in particular, the reason I wanted to mention with this last statistic is to preface the clips that I'm about to play, which speak on the discrimination that trans people may face within BAME communities. So I just wanted to kind of, make sure that I wasn't trying to paint a picture that, BAME communities or POC communities are, as is often portrayed, particularly more homophobic or transphobic, etc. But it's important to, and as I say, this isn't with a view to absolving white or non-trans people from their responsibilities with regards to this discussion, but it's to really look at how colonization and racism have erased QTPOC histories to a point where as people of color, sometimes our own understanding of our own histories have been corrupted by colonization. So I'm going to play a couple of clips together. The first is Laverne Cox, and she's a great source if you just want to Google and learn more about this. So the first is again on Laverne Cox, and then the second is from Dr. Stephanie Davis, whose research has focused on this issue. She does a full talk on this on the Race in Britain YouTube channel, so do look for it. Also to add as well, the first clip contains descriptions of racist violence, relatively graphic. And the second clip, the sound quality is a little patchy, but it is audible, so do bear with it. So here's my attempt at trying to move screens again.
Now, I've often said too publicly the truth of my experience, and I've been criticized for it, but gotta tell the truth. And the truth is that most of the bullying and harassment I've experienced throughout my life has been from other Black folks. And I'm always careful to say this is not to suggest that Black folks are more homophobic or transphobic than everybody else, because I do not believe that. But I do believe that often marginalized groups police each other. So that Black folks police other Black folks, women police other women, gay folks police other gay folks, etc., etc. And I think for Black folks too, there's another component here. There's another piece. Literally, in this country, we have a literal history of emasculating Black men. A literal history in America of emasculating Black men. During slavery, during Jim Crow, in this country, Black male bodies were routinely lynched. And during these lynchings, often their genitalia was cut off. Sometimes pickled, sometimes sold. This is a literal history of emasculating Black men. And I believe that a lot of Black folks have looked at me in various incarnations of my femininity throughout my life and imagined that I am the realization of the historic emasculation of Black men. And they have lashed out in a tremendous amount of pain.
And in my PhD research, there was a lot of talking about trying to decolonize gender and sexuality, and how queer and trans people of colour are often stuck in a weird sort of place where they, in terms of the cultural wars, so in the Caribbean where my family are from, there's the idea that queerness and transness are colonial inventions rather, and that before that there was no like queer or trans people. And actually thinking about, and then when we try and discuss how actually it was the colonial invention, homophobia itself, the homophobic laws were brought into the Caribbean and into that African continent, that's not considered, and that's denied. And so Keachbok are in a difficult, tense position in which they're in between these arguments, and often seen as neo-colonial arguments in terms of embracing LGBT identities in the Caribbean and in the African continent. So participants in my research, but also in Jackie Alexander's work, talk about trying to develop like a counter-hegemonic memory of what queerness and transness was maybe before colonisation, or how they still continue to exist. So in terms of Zami or Mati work, or Man Royals, so Zami is the Caribbean term for women loving women, and women living in community together. So it might not directly translate to lesbianism or bisexuality, but some black lesbians find it powerful to reclaim those, to show that they have existed, and to challenge the silences around gender and sexual diversity. And then, thinking about, for me, of the power of people like Black Perverts Network and Black activists who are talking about sexual desire and pleasure and sensuality, making space to reclaim those things. So in Tongues Untied by Marlon Briggs, him talking about black men loving black men as the revolutionary act, which is powerful in terms of rejecting heterosexist and masculinist ideas of what it means to be a man of colour or a black man.
Sorry, I got into a blind panic there because the charge on my other laptop was about to die, but thankfully, crisis averted. So yeah, we will explore some of those issues, looking at decolonizing curriculums, making sure that as people of color, we understand our histories better and how allies can kind of support that process. Before we get into that, I just want to pick up on a resource that I discovered from a really great trans activist in the UK called Sabah Chowdhury. They are trans, Muslim, and South Asian, and they've put together a resource on how to make spaces safe for trans people of color. Some of it speaks to LGBT spaces, so how you make those spaces accessible, but also I think they're applicable quite generally. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, so I've just kind of picked out a few kind of things to consider, just really practical things to consider when organizing an event to make sure that it's inclusive. And so one thing here is venue and location. And obviously we know that's important for multiple different reasons, including kind of accessibility. So here it speaks about ensuring positive visual representation of BAME people, and that a copy of equal opportunity statements is by the door. Often a major factor that influences whether people attend meetings and access support is where the support is. So for a lot of BAME people, safety and discretion is a huge issue. So it would be a challenge to attend a BAME group in a building that is visibly LGBT from the outside or by name. So trying to find a neutral space is ideal, such as a multi-purpose community centre. Other things you might want to consider are obviously language and distribution or advertising. So when publicizing events and services, and I think LARAF have been quite good at this, short statements such as we welcome people of all sexualities, gender identities and faith backgrounds, or queer and trans people of color and faith are welcome here, can be helpful whilst recognizing the reality of an intersectional identity is complex. And then the last thing to think about, and this is again why for this session we partnered with the Labour Campaign for Trans Rights, is on partnership work and outreach. So partnership work is one of the keys to building a stronger community. Partnerships can inspire creativity, add diversity, increase capacity, save money and resources, and help you reach a wider audience. And I think that last thing is incredibly important to emphasize. It's not the case that everybody will have the ability to become an expert in these issues. And actually, a lot of the time, you know, we need to make sure we're being led by the communities in question, and also recognize where we need to defer to another organization or another person's expertise. Yeah, looking for organizations that can help in that regard is really important. And then finally, follow up. So for those of you who've started groups before, you'll be familiar with retention rate and the importance of members coming back. When members come back, it's a signal that the group is providing a useful tool for the community. For BAME people, there are many reasons why they do not come back, and many do only access spaces once or twice. And actually, that's really pertinent to work I'm doing at the moment with lesbians and gay support the migrants. We've noticed this issue within the group. And I'm working with others to do some consultation work to just try and understand that issue more, and continually do what we can to make sure that it's a space that is accessible to people of color, to trans people of color, to people of various identities. So my other laptop has finally died, but thankfully I do think I know where we're going next. Before I do speak about the breakout rooms, can I ask one of the other facilitators to let me know if there's anything within the chat that I need to pick up on just now?
Nothing as yet.
No? Okay, that's great. Okay, so we're going to spend, I think, 10 minutes, I think should be good. 15 possibly if we have the time, but 10 minutes to discuss two questions based on some of the things that have come up. So the two questions I want us to think about in our breakout rooms is, the first is, how do we make sure in the fight for trans rights, we make sure that it's an intersectional fight? And then the second is thinking about the left spaces that we're in or that we know about, is how do we make them safe for Black trans people, for trans people of color? There will be facilitators in both rooms. Okay, yeah, thank you for participating. I really appreciate it is a difficult discussion. And, you know, one of the things came up in our group was, you know, people feeling reluctant because maybe they're not part of the community we're talking about. That's obviously the case for me as well in doing this presentation. And obviously we thought about when we were at the point where we couldn't secure a speaker for this session, we hit a crossroads as to whether we continue or not. But as I said at the beginning of this discussion, we decided to take on the challenge of self-education. So yeah, if you have something to contribute and you're not taking up the space of somebody who can speak about their lived experience, then I'd always encourage people to step forward. On which note, hopefully there are people designated from both groups to report back. If you can just mention like a kind of, well, yeah, just a little summary. We've got enough time of the discussion that took place. So either group can go first. I was in the group that Mehmet facilitated. I think Laura's reporting back. Laura, are you happy to go first?
Yeah, I think we were just talking just then about how we need to look at like history and look at how like Black trans women like led the way, and how like decolonizing our curriculum and how that needs to be discussed, and so that everyone understands like the history. I mentioned a bit about how the Labour Party has a lot like big steps to go in terms of just basic you know, understanding of trans like issues and rights, and how we as like cis people can often be in those rooms that they don't feel comfortable in, and it's about passing policy in our like local CLPs to, you know, like keeping our MPs accountable, because it's a massive issue within like the Labour Party. I'm using that as like a left space, but that's what we were kind of discussing. And then I kind of just said that like you were just saying then, we need to have that opportunity where as cis white people, like as a cis white person or as cis people, if we have those opportunities to pass the mic to people, like we should absolutely do that every opportunity possible. If somebody is more you know, like live that experience, then they should obviously speak on that, but don't feel like you can't help somebody. You know, if you're surrounded by like a group of cis people, you can champion someone else's voice, you can champion their like cause kind of thing, because that's the only way we're going to be ever able to change anything within the left or the Labour Party, is to have those conversations with people. It might feel uncomfortable, but that's how we have to move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That was like so well put, particularly the point about having uncomfortable conversations. Like we need to put ourselves in that position. We know where things are with regards to trans rights. Almost all the conversations are probably going to be uncomfortable right now, and we just have to live with that. And if we do it together, hopefully, then it's less uncomfortable. Will, I don't know who is reporting from the second group. Can they speak up?
I'm happy to. Yeah, if there was someone else, I believe Leslie.
Yeah, sorry, Leslie. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Leslie, he, him. Right, I'm sorry, I probably not remember all the very, very excellent points being made, so please feel free to come in after me if I've missed you, which I probably will do, I'm sorry. I thought there was a very good point made about the fact that, unfortunately, in the LGBTQ plus community, there can be a tendency to kind of segregate trans people, and perhaps particularly trans people of colour, and that this is not helpful. Also, that unfortunately there can be a tendency for different areas of struggles for liberation to be seen as, in a sense, competing with each other. So, for example, it might be seen that some aspects of LGBT rights conflict with some aspects of fighting for trans rights, or particularly in the current situation, this is my idea. Unfortunately, it seems to be perceived that the struggle for trans rights can be, in some respects, a threat to the quite correct needs of women to have their safety and rights respected, and also that there could be some, possibly some perceived competition between the rights of Black and minority ethnic people, people of colour, and LGBTQ plus and or trans rights. I think that's as I say, I'm sure I haven't covered the discussion at all adequately, so please do supplement. I've done my best. I'm sorry, I'm just a wee bit tired.
Thank you, Leslie. I think the point on solidarity is so well taken, and I think yeah, we often have a tendency to kind of divide our struggles to the point where it kind of stops us in our tracks. Does anybody from that group want to add anything to what Leslie just said? I think Artin thought you did a good job, so.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for all that. And yeah, and we were talking, yeah, exactly about what Leslie said. Although we didn't quite get to speak about the second question as much, and so yeah, it'd be great to hear kind of other people's kind of opinions on that. I know, like personally, as a CLP chair, you know, thinking about what what we could be doing to make it a more welcoming space for trans people, in particular, obviously trans people of colour. You know, it'd be great to hear, and thanks Nav for pointing kind of some things out already earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And as I say, there's this really useful resource that will be shared after this. I think we're coming to the end of the session. There's one little video I want to show, but before that, I just want to hand over to Artin briefly, just to mention a couple of things.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So just briefly before we go, thank you to everyone for coming, obviously, to this session, and also to some of you who came to our earlier sessions. LARAF and Socialists of Colours conference continues tomorrow with a series of workshops and sessions starting at 11:30 AM, and that's on histories of racist state violence. And then later on at 1 PM, we've got strategies for the resistance session. And then at 3:30 in the afternoon, we've got a Black Lives Matter building on the movement session. We'll post the links in the chat box now, so please do join that. And there is also tonight still time to sign up for our Mafia Spike Up social, and that's hosted by comrades from the World Transformed. So do join us for that. Do join us tomorrow. And once again, thank you very much, Nav, for hosting this session.
Yeah, thanks, Artin. So yeah, just the last thing I just want to finish the session on is to say thank you for joining. As I say, I know it wasn't advertised exactly as intended, but hopefully you've got something useful from this, and LARAF hopefully will engage in this issue further. I just want to end with a clip from someone I mentioned earlier, Sabah Chowdhury, who wrote that guide on making spaces safe for trans people of color. They did a really brilliant TED talk. Again, you can find it all online. But I think in it, they really beautifully articulate their lived experience. And I think it's important when we do all of this work to understand on the other side of this is about, you know, making people's lives like enriching, and, you know, that they can do what they want to do. So hopefully, another attempt at technology here. I'm going to play this, and then feel free to jump off at the end of the call. I'll end the call after that.
When I got accepted to do this TEDx talk, I was asked, Sabah, who is your role model? Oh, my role model, someone I've always looked up to, someone I've aspired to be since I was younger. I think back to when I was little, and there was no one like me to look up to. No one queer, brown, or hairy. It felt like people like me didn't exist. And I think there's a certain privilege to be having a role model, to be able to see that there's someone like you in the paper, in the TV, in your family. Someone who's being every part of themselves, smiling and surviving. We cannot deny how influential the media is in this. And recently, we are seeing the trans narrative explored on TV. But whose trans narrative? It's still rare to see a trans person of color in the media who has survived. But here I am. And don't let this end here in this room. Amplify our voices and share our stories. Give trans people of color and faith a platform. Stand by us and let us rise. Acknowledge our pain and share our pride. Because we must carve out our own spaces, write our own narrative, tell our own stories, and live to tell the tale. I am trans enough. I am brown enough. I am Muslim enough. This is my story. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining, everyone. And hopefully we'll be doing more on this in the future. So thank you.